Coming up on Chopper's Politics.
This isn't about protecting conservative values. This is protecting British values, the fundamental value of free speech.
The countdown begins. We've seen the roadmap out of lockdown, and everyone's marked June the 21st on their calendars as the day life might get back to normal. Although the government would like us all to remember their new mantra.
At every stage, our decisions will be led by data, not dates.
I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent, and this is Chopper's Politics. And we'll of course be chatting about the route out of lockdown this week, so do stay tuned to hear from Patrick O'Flynn, the former MEP and political commentator, about why the announcements from Boris Johnson have left him feeling, well, a bit micromanaged by the Prime Minister, not really liberated as he might have wanted. And away from coronavirus, this week also saw Oliver Dowden, the Culture Secretary, calling in leading heritage bodies like the National Trust and Historic England for a summit. He wanted them to, according to a departmental source, defend our culture from a noisy minority of activists that are trying to do Britain down. Well, later, Sir Stephen Bubb, a leading cheerleader for charities, will set out the case of their defence in no uncertain terms. But first, the most certain part of the roadmap, in England at least, is the big return to the classroom on March the 8th. But one group not definitely heading back to the face-to-face teaching on that date is university students. So I thought now is the best time for a catch-up with Universities Minister Michelle Donelan about what universities can learn from this year, whether students have been not getting value for money, and freedom of speech on campuses. And like thousands of students, we caught up via Zoom. Michelle Donelan, the Universities Minister, welcome to Chopper's Politics.
Thank you for having me on.
Now, you wrote to students on February the 22nd this week, saying they should stay where they are until in-person teaching starts. How is this value for money for them? They're paying £9,000 a year, but they're being told they can't go and be taught.
Yeah, so we've got some of them back on those critical key worker courses, allied health, teacher training, social work, etc. And then from the 8th of March, we'll be able to get back all of the practical and creative subjects, so ranging from dance and drama right the way through to STEM. And then for the remaining lot, we're going to review it in Easter holidays and give them at least 1 week's notice. Now, this has been a really difficult and challenging time for students, as you touch on. And there have been questions around value for money and appropriateness of tuition. However, at every stage of this, we have tried to prioritise education to ensure that there's no gaps, and we've not asked university students to put their academic journeys on hold. We've managed to do that. Our number one priority is ensuring that students can graduate on time, can get those world-class degrees. And we've seen some really innovative and exciting tuition coming out of our universities, and higher education staff have worked tirelessly to be able to produce that. But there is a process in place should students feel that they're not getting that value. I would urge them to make a formal complaint to their university and then potentially take it to the OIA, which can indeed lead to a fee refund. In addition, the Office for Students have a notification process where they get notifications from students and they go and investigate that and look at the quality and look at the provision being taken and the steps being taken by universities. So there is measures in place to support students who feel that they're not getting adequate tuition at this time.
Do you think lectures by Zoom is worth £9,000 a year?
So I think what we've said as a government is basically we set the maximum level of tuition fees, which is £9,250. It's up to a university then. They have full freedom to charge less. Every university have decided, well, nobody is. That was my second point. Every single institution has decided to continue to charge that maximum. So we've been really clear. We therefore expect the quantity of teaching hours to be maintained, for it to be accessible, and also for quality to be maintained. And there's a number of checks and balances within the system to ensure that. For one thing, it's an OFS registration condition that quality has to be maintained. As I say, there is a process in place to support those students that don't think they're getting that.
How easy is it to get a discount? Have you tried to do it, just as a minister trying to work out how easy it is for the consumer to get money back?
Students are consumers by the very nature of the contract that they sign. They have consumer rights. The first step should be to talk to your university. You might not need to get to that stage, maybe able to work it out with them, do a formal complaint, and then you can go to the OIA. We do know that they're dealing with a number of cases at the moment that are COVID related, and that in the past they have given out fee refunds when we had the strike action, etc. So it isn't out of the realms of possibility. But also at the same time, there are a number of students that are accessing excellent provision. Yes, it's different, and they aren't getting that student experience at all of like I got, and I'm sure you got when you went to university, and because of the restrictions in place, and we all want them to be back to getting that. And the roadmap announced this week allows us that possibility.
What about rent rebates? You've got students who are not allowed back into accommodation they're paying for.
Yeah, this is really challenging, and I understand where students are coming from and their parents when they raise this as an issue. And that's why we've urged all accommodation providers to really put students' best interests at the heart of their decision making, and where possible to give refunds. Now, that is much more possible for universities or large providers of accommodation, and we've seen that happening. We've also seen large accommodation providers like Unite do that. It is harder for the small landlords that may own one or two properties and rely on that income. And that's one of the reasons why we have given 70 million that has to be spent by the end of this financial year to universities for students to apply to access hardship funding to support them at these really difficult and challenging times.
We are looking towards a return to normal teaching in universities later this summer, and of course for the full academic year next year.
Well, that's certainly the plan. And it's a very positive plan that the Prime Minister has outlined, and also cautious and measured so that we don't have to reverse. Obviously, these things are always subject to the data, which is a very clear message that we must focus on data rather than dates. But of course, we all want to get back to a much more normal setup. That in mind, I do hear heavily how the higher education sector has advanced many years because of this pandemic. It's catapulted our progress with our use of technology and innovative learning. And I know that some of that will be retained to adapt the way that we can teach in the higher education arena, but also to make it much more flexible. For instance, I'm confident that we will see international students not having to commit to come here for the entire 3 years, or we may see students being able to learn more flexibly because of this digitalization.
So we could be seeing a lot more entire courses done by Zoom, which could lead to an increase in courses being given by universities.
I'm not sure I would agree that we're going to see entire courses via Zoom. I think that what we will see is an opening up of our education system, especially in higher education, to a more flexible way of learning that suits people's lifestyles. And that's also part of our agenda as a government with the lifelong learning entitlement and breaking down education at a higher level to more modular provision, so it can be done alongside work or taking career breaks, so that it is much more accessible to that other 50% who would never even dreamt of entering higher education. This is about opening it up to them at a later stage in life. And I think technology will play an essential role in that, but there is no substitute for the face-to-face learning, especially in certain courses, and that's why we want to get students back as quickly as we possibly can.
Do you think universities or the government could do more to help those students who've had to withdraw from their studies because of mental health? Anecdotally, we all know children and friends who've had to drop out from university.
So dropout rates are actually lower than this time last year. So our statistics show that so far that hasn't happened. And we're looking at that from working with the SLC in relation to student loans. Obviously, the mental health and wellbeing pressures of this pandemic have been difficult for a number of people across society, and especially, I would argue, for students. And that is something that I've always tried to prioritise. I've asked universities to prioritise, to make sure that they move provision online so it's still accessible at all times. We launched Student Space with the Office for Students, which is an online platform that costs £3 million, and it's just for this period of time during COVID, and it's to fill in some of the gaps. I've set up a wellbeing and mental health working group, and we've produced some material there to really flag to students the support and information that is available now, and also to their providers. And as a government, this is a priority for young people across the board in all sections of education. We've got an action group that launches next week formally, that's chaired by myself and the Minister for Children, Minister Ford, and will be attended by Dr. Alex George. And this is something that the government is taking seriously, because the toll on young people in terms of their mental health and wellbeing is something that we need to prioritise so that the support is available to all young people. I know, speaking to a number of students in their final year, for instance, they're concerned about when they graduate, will they be able to get a job? How will their degree be viewed? All of these things can weigh heavily on the shoulders of our young. And so it is important that we keep this at the forefront of not only our minds, but also our actions.
Now, last week, Gavin Williamson, the Education Secretary, set out plans to strengthen free speech at universities. That will include a free speech champion at the Office of Students to fight for it. When will this new champion be appointed?
So we are going to progress legislation this year. So we'll be subject to the parliamentary timetable, but we're eager to get it done as quickly as possible. We do identify that there is a need there. This is honouring our manifesto. And I also think if the pandemic's proven one thing to us all, it's just how much we should value freedom. And there is a problem. Free speech and academic freedom is a fundamental pillar of our democracy and our society. And we are seeing examples of speakers being platformed. We're seeing examples of academics complaining that they're having their reading lists curtailed, of students feeling that they're censored. And so this is something that we have to tackle head on.
Is it mainly one-way traffic, i.e. is it Conservatives being shut down on campuses?
Absolutely not. No, I definitely don't agree with that. If you look at Selina Todd, for example, and the fact that she has to have security, and she's certainly not a conservative voter. So this is across the whole board. In fact, some of this is also about protecting the freedom to express views that are really controversial. Some of these views I wouldn't agree with at all. And you might not agree with. But I always think of that quote by Evelyn Hall that I disapprove of what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it. And that's certainly my sentiment, because we do need to challenge the status quo. We do need to challenge the existing views so that we can progress society. That's how we reform, that's how we advance, and that's how we learn as well, which is fundamental in our higher education institutions. And we have been seeing, this cancel culture and the chilling effect. The chilling effect is the thing that really worries me, because that's so unquantifiable. We have no real idea of how many people out there feel that they have to restrict themselves and self-censor. And that is the really worrying impact. How many students out there are stifling what they say, which could be brilliant ideas potentially that could progress us.
Do you have any evidence of Conservatives being afraid to speak out and say that they might support Boris Johnson?
So I really want to take this away from this being viewed as a policy to protect conservative views or conservative ideas, because it is about all ideas and views. I mean, there is a policy exchange stat that shows that 4 out of 10 students who voted in the UK to leave the European Union have felt uncomfortable expressing it. Obviously, that isn't synonymous with the Conservative Party.
Course,
that was across political parties. But this isn't about protecting conservative values. This is protecting British values, the fundamental value of free speech.
Were you surprised by the reaction to the news last week? It seemed to really offend a lot of people.
No, I think it's quite surprising that some people are saying there's no problem with free speech. And my response to that is always, well, if there is no problem with free speech, there will be no problem with these reforms then, because it will almost be business as usual. But there is a problem, and we know that from the cases like Noel Carl or Jordan Peterson, and those that we don't know about, hence the chilling effect.
Where do you draw the line there? With free speech, there was a point when everyone is offended by what someone is saying, and that person has to be shut down. But is that up to this new person in the Office of Students, this free speech champion? It's quite a difficult position to be in, I imagine.
The key thing here is this free speech law that we will introduce will not eradicate the current law. It's free speech within the law. So if somebody is inciting violence, inciting terrorism, is committing a hate crime, all of those things will still be illegal and still can be taken to the police to address. This is about free speech within the context of the law. And yes, we're having an academic freedom champion that will be able to almost investigate and look at these cases. But our reform goes broader than that. What we're also doing is bringing into scope student unions. We're producing a best practice guide. We're opening up the existing legislation. So it's not just about protecting academic freedom, but actually about promoting academic freedom. So you're creating this culture of openness and inclusivity where people feel able to express their views and challenge the status quo. Views can offend without being illegal. But hate crimes are very specific, and they are an attack on individual groups in our society. And this will not contradict that.
Where do you sit on the so-called wokeification of universities? You know what I mean, don't you? Less university understood to have stopped teaching Chaucer, for example.
Yeah, so I think we've got to be really careful here. This is a very dangerous and slippy road. The so-called decolonization of the curriculum is in effect censoring our history. And as a history student myself, I'm a vehement protector and champion of safeguarding our history, because I do think it otherwise becomes fiction if you start editing it, taking bits out that we view as stains. And also, a fundamental part of our history is about learning from it, not repeating the mistakes, being able to analyze and challenge why those events happened, how those decisions were made, so that we don't repeat those actions in the future. And I also wonder if we're going down this road of taking bits out, are we then going to end up putting bits in that we wish had happened? It's a very dangerous and odd road to go down. And certainly, it has no place in our universities, I would argue, and it has no place in academic study. And it just doesn't work when governments try to remove elements of history. Look at the Soviet Union, look at China. There are multiple examples where it's been tried. It doesn't work.
We had Professor Corinne Fowler on this podcast a few weeks ago about this, and she was saying the problem is that schools haven't been taught the full warts and all history of colonialism and the fact that slavery was a big part of this country's economy for centuries until it was got rid of, and we fought against it as this country in the 19th century. Is she right, do you think, to say that?
So I'm all in favour of adding stuff in to enriching our understanding of history, to adding in sources from less well-known and often overlooked individuals in history. Certainly, absolutely. Let's enrich our understanding and give our young people a fuller picture and a fuller and deeper understanding of our history. But most of the narrative that is coming out, when you actually look at what people on this agenda say, is about removing elements of history, about whitewashing it and pretending that it never happened, which I just think is naive and almost irresponsible.
What examples do you have of that, of this whitewashing of history?
So a lot of the talk of the decolonization is actually removing those elements. It's not about packing in extra into history. And when you look at people that are saying that our study is wrong in the UK, you don't often hear them talking about just enriching the sources that are used for students to study from. It's about removing certain texts and books and replacing them with alternatives. I also feel sorry for the students here. I mean, students want to actually properly learn. And if we're adding stuff in, brilliant, but taking it out is not going to achieve them learning.
And just finally, will this area come under the remit of this free speech champion, do you think?
So the free speech champion is much more about the ability to discuss and to challenge and to question. But of course, censoring is an element of free speech. So if academics, who also will be able to go to the free speech champion as well as students, feel that their reading lists have been censored, for instance, of course they could. So the two dovetail together, I agree.
Of course, yeah. And did you see a big number of fines being levied against providers or student bodies that are found guilty of suppressing free speech?
Well, there will be a punitive element to this and repercussions. But I also think that by beefing up our legislation and also having the requirement to promote academic freedom, that it will shift the dynamic and that universities will take this much more seriously and drill down into this as an issue. So hopefully that will almost change things without having to have multiple fines. But of course, there will be that process in place to safeguard should we need it. Michelle
Donelan, the Higher Education Minister, thank you for joining us this week on Choppers Politics. It's been great to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
A fascinating discussion there about the role of history and free speech at the end of my chat with the university's minister. And do stay with us because in just a moment we'll be going back to that subject right after this.
Hello, former England hooker Brian Moore here. Well, the Six Nations is back and so is my podcast, Brian Moore's Full Contact. Each week we will get the biggest and best names from the world of rugby to dive into every ruck, maul and TMO decision. You can't nab a front row seat this year, but with our podcast you don't need to. So just search for Brian Moore's Full Contact on your podcast app, hit the subscribe button to make sure you don't miss it.
And we're back. Now, this week, Oliver Dowden, the Culture Secretary, has urged a group of the UK's biggest heritage bodies, museums and art galleries not to skew the public's understanding of Britain's imperial past. He urged organisations not to single out the most notorious events from the empire, but instead provide a more rounded view of how they fit in within the UK's wider impact on the world. It follows a series of reviews in the past few months from charities and groups into past colonial links and connections to the slave trade. So who better to discuss this very topic than with Sir Stephen Bubb, Director of the Oxford Institute for Charity, and who runs Charity Futures, a think tank looking at the future of the voluntary sector. I started by asking Sir Stephen Bubb a big question. Have charities and heritage bodies had a big woke takeover?
No, no, they haven't. And perhaps it's at this point, it's worth just thinking about what that word means. And obviously, it was a term that Americans use, but it's a term that implies people are interested and concerned about social justice and racial justice. So in that context, I suspect, Christopher, you're woke and I'm woke.
Yes.
It's become an insult, and I think that's unhelpful. In terms of charities, part of their DNA is to be concerned about issues around social justice, racial justice. The genius of charities in this country is that combination of the providing services for people, advice and support, together with a campaigning spirit. We're founded on activism, if you like, and that's what is so wonderful about charities. So if we're not concerned about social justice, then we probably ought to pack up our bags and go back to sleep.
Don't you worry, Stephen Bubb, that being founded on activism, that activism has now got into the boardroom and is infecting the good works of maybe the National Trust?
No. Activism is always good. I mean, for goodness sake, activism, the sort of 6 million volunteers in charities are activists. It's always interesting to look at charity history and to think about, how a lot of we're talking about history and rewriting history. Okay, so a lot of our social legislation in this country has come about through charity campaigning and activism. I mean, let's look at slavery, because that's rather pertinent to the issues in terms of the National Trust. History, when I was a kid, history was taught in terms of the acts of great men. So slavery is often talked about as the sort of work of William Wilberforce, who was a great man. But the reality is that he was only successful because there was a huge civil society campaign, charities, churches, individuals, women's groups, of a big petition. And so the groundswell of what would now undoubtedly be described in the Daily Telegraph as woke warriors, that led to William Wilberforce's ability to end the slave trade and then the abolition of slavery in 1833. So I think it is very relevant. And I think telling that story is important, because when you talk about rewriting British history, this implies there is a body of history that is written in stone, approved by the government in some sort of Stalinist way, and that it is not capable of being changed when you uncover further facts. Now, no historian will say that history is anything other than dynamic and evolving. So our understanding of history is now informed by understanding things like social history, like economic history. And of course, charities play a big part.
What you're saying is it's quite normal for charities to rub up against the government, like happened this week when Oliver Dowden called in 25 heritage bodies, all the big famous ones you've heard of, for a heritage summit in which he wanted to remind them to stop doing Britain down. So why are charities doing Britain down?
Well, let's tackle Oliver Dowden, shall we? Now, I think it's a confounded cheek that he has called charities in. And the reason I say that is because charities have suffered tremendously in this pandemic. They're losing money. They are cutting staff. Some of them are closing. Now, Oliver Dowden has the brief for charities in government. So instead of calling a summit to say, listen, how can I help you? How can I support you? He's calling them to wag a finger. Now, that's not acceptable.
Everyone accepts charities have had a difficult time in the pandemic, as have businesses.
Sure.
So it's an issue of priorities, isn't it?
Well, then what's an odd priority to say that to medical research charities who do something like 1/3 and a half of all medical research in this country, who are now cutting programs, cutting research. Fancy saying to charities like that, like the heritage charities, actually, the thing I want to talk to you about is you've been naughty, as opposed to, listen, how can I help you? Because I know charities are the backbone of our social society.
This goes back, surely, Stephen Bubb, to a disconnect between the people who raise money for these charities and the way they're being run. And people who raise it just don't understand why some are pursuing these agendas as they see it, which is not where they sit. And they don't want to have political views rammed down their throats by charities, when really charities should be out there doing the public good. That's why they're charitable.
Well, the public good, as I have I've been saying, encompasses both providing services and campaigning. Now, if you say to a whole heap of people who support disability charities, volunteers, etc., that charity shouldn't be engaged in political argument and discussion about changing legislation on behalf of those people, then that's a very odd understanding of charity. But the other point I'd make, Christopher, is that, this is a loose and baggy monster we're talking about. This is 160,000 organisation. Where I live in the Cotswolds, there was about 50 different charities, the Bowls Club, the Cricket Club. These are not sort of infested with metropolitan elites,
No one's calling the Bowls Club in from the Cotswolds for a chat about slavery and colonialism. Is it the point, Stephen Bubb, that people feel they are being made to feel ashamed about being British? And then you have, as they would see it, people emphasising parts of this country's history and then not emphasising the way, say, that Britain got rid of slavery. And in fact, Britons lost their lives fighting slavery in the 19th century.
Well, Christopher, I don't agree with the premise. I don't agree that's what charities are doing at all. It's certainly not what the National Trust is doing. I mean, history is a complex thing. Obviously, the story of empire, story of slavery contains good events and bad events. The Royal Navy, for example, stopping slave ships. And that is what the National Trust will actually do when they look at the report they've got and how they explain that report in terms of the houses they run. Let's go to the National Trust, as this seems to be such a bone of contention. I thought it was fascinating. There was a story in the press recently about something that happened in lockdown, where a group of school kids were at a grand stately home. They asked the obvious question to the National Trust volunteer, well, where did the money come from to build this wonderful place? And the National Trust volunteer, poor thing, was rather stumped for this. Well, fortunately, the aristocratic former owner was actually was in the room and came across, well, I'll tell you, it came from the proceeds of slavery. I mean, that's simply just a fact. And why should that not be told, along with all the other facts about that house and the good things that happened?
It seems to be the equating of, or the linking of slavery and colonialism, which so stirred up people last year. We had Michelle Donelan, the universities minister, on this podcast earlier, and she said that she didn't approve of whitewashing bits of history by removing aspects of syllabuses or downplaying books or removing books from reading this. Isn't that what you're saying in a way? I mean, all elements of history need to be represented,
yes.
Good and bad. Aren't you basically on the same side? Haven't we all gone mad in lockdown? Aren't you basically arguing with yourself?
Well, Chris, I mean, that's a good point. I think when passions are aroused in debates like this, it's often the sort of the extremes that get listened to. So you have the ludicrously named a common sense group of MPs on the one hand, demanding charities stop running down Britain. And on the other, you've got a whole heap of actors wanting to tear down statues and making a disgraceful, abusive remarks about Churchill. So they're sort of like the people in the middle. I suspect that's you and me, Christopher, us woke people, find it difficult to debate this sensibly.
Well, Stephen Bubb, it's never dull talking to you even from the Cotswolds. Thank you for joining us this week on Choppers Politics. Thank you.
Good to talk to you.
Now, next month, we mark a difficult anniversary. 1 year since the first lockdown was imposed on this country. And we finally have a way out, a roadmap, presented this week by Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister. A degree of a return to normality, in England at least. And by June the 21st, life might be back, well, to normal. Yes, Boris Johnson is taking the scenic route out of lockdown. Schools will kick off the reopening on March 8th with 4 stages of easing, each at least 5 weeks apart, so the scientists can see the impact of each change. And that's all too scenic for our next guest, former journalist and former MEP Patrick O'Flynn. An article Patrick wrote this week for the Telegraph caught my eye, so I gave him a call. And I started by playing him a video that went viral last year from someone who, like him, doesn't necessarily agree with government hand-holding.
Boris is sort of leaving it up to us a little bit to sort of, if you feel safe to do so, then do it. It's not really hard to understand. Can't understand that, be sensible in what you're doing and stay away, 2 metres apart when you can, and, wear your PPE if you're at work, then, I'm not sure. What do you want, a full handbook to tell you what to do?
Patrick O'Flynn, that was the plumber Ryan Price in May last year. We're speaking in the week that Boris Johnson set out his roadmap for exiting lockdown in 118 days' time. Boris Johnson said last September in the House of Commons that our country is a freedom-loving country. Matt Hancock told me in an interview for the Telegraph last December that he's a freedom-loving Tory. It's all very well saying it, isn't it?
They seem to have yielded on that principle quite easily. And I'm someone who supported the latest lockdown, because of the data and also because it had an inbuilt exit strategy, unlike the previous one, which is mass vaccination. And yet they seem to be unwilling to yield the bounty of mass vaccination. We see from the polls, Boris seems to be in the mainstream of where public opinion is. And yet, on a philosophical point for a guy like him, he might think that, the majority is still on my side, but is the threshold of harm that we are preventing by these extraordinary withdrawals of personal liberty, can that be justified in respect of the state's relationship with individuals? Or should individuals have the fundamental right to free association and all the rest of it, absent a total emergency? And I would suggest mass vaccination has already reached a level where the total emergency threshold has not been cleared. And yet even someone like Boris, who's written many articles for the Telegraph about civil liberties, didn't seem to reflect on that aspect at all. And I find that a bit disturbing.
Is that because, do you think politics has changed? I mean, Ronald Reagan said in 1986 that the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help, as you know.
Yeah.
But nowadays it's I'm from the government and I'm here to vaccinate. So surely the government has a good thing to talk about. I mean, in the sense the government's intervention in our lives actually is a good thing now.
Well, yeah, and I think that Ronald Reagan, it was a good joke, but it didn't really describe reality. And I think the sort of widespread support for that view probably fell away during the financial crisis, where I'm here from the government actually led to cash points not running out of money because the private sector had screwed things up in such a monumental way. So I think, yes, you can take a balanced view that says the state, and all its arms and its coordinating ability is absolutely essential to civilized life. But that doesn't mean you got to submit to total state control. I still think those within politics and within the Conservative Party traditionally should be thinking more about right and wrong in terms of the withdrawal of fundamental civil liberties and the high bar that would need to be cleared before that is justifiable.
In the piece for the Telegraph you wrote this week, which we'll put into the show notes on this episode, you talked about the Soviet Union, 2 words not often used in modern day politics, but the Soviet Union collapsed because in the end its command economy couldn't compete with free markets. Is it overdone to bring the Soviet Union into a discussion about lockdown in Britain?
Well, look, the point I was trying to make there was the basic point that if you let people decide more to do with their own lives, they tend to obviously understand what brings them pleasure and happiness. And yes, in economics, the command economy of the Soviet model, it just couldn't compete in delivering prosperity and material contentment. And equally, that should tell certainly a Conservative government and the ministers within it to remember that if you remove agency and free choice from your population, that this is going to lead to a loss of their personal ability to do the things that make them happy. And in the end, that is not a route to a contented society in any way. So, I'm not quite suggesting that the government is behaving like the KGB. I'm just saying this very fundamental principle seems to have got lost, even by a Prime Minister in Boris Johnson, who has always been regarded as, Mr. Freedom Lover.
I am struck by studying Hansard as I do in my job, and the Department of Health says it's made no effort to assess the impact of loneliness. Do you think that only one side of the ledger is being taken into account of when they decide these policies?
Well, I think that probably is the case. And I think the ministers who are dealing with this are pretty much the same ministers in the same jobs that they were a year ago, including obviously the Prime Minister. And they wouldn't be human were they not to have half an eye on the impending public inquiry. And I think for them, they're looking at the number of people who've already died. And they're thinking, got to do everything imaginable to stop that rising, because that's what we'll be judged on, and not the other bad stuff that millions of people will be experiencing.
Do you think that's the risk to the government? If you step back, you're a seasoned commentator on politics. You worked for the Daily Express. You wrote an excellent column for years there before dabbling in politics with UKIP and now with the SDP. Do you think that although Boris Johnson's riding high at the moment, that's because this is a national crisis and people will see it as such? But when the political row starts, that's when you'll have a problem for the Tory government in the opinion polls.
I don't really see that, Chris, to be honest. I think we have a main opposition party which is completely unelectable, riddled with incompetence and obsession with minority pursuits such as extreme identity politics. I think that the course of British politics was set for a decade in that general election win in December 2019. I also think that the government obviously employs a lot of pollsters. And if they need to tack a little bit more towards the libertarian side of things to keep their voters happy, they've got plenty of room to do that. The Farage threat hasn't really come forward with Reform UK. He seems to me a bit half-hearted about that and can't find the key issue. So I don't think electability has much bearing on this. I think the Conservatives and Boris Johnson are completely in control of the party political terrain.
We're not seeing any kind of protests, are we, like we have seen in Germany and other countries on the continent against mask wearing, against lockdown, all this kind of thing. Why is that? And might that be changing this summer, do you think?
We certainly haven't seen such big organised protests. I think we have seen some, haven't we, normally resulting in Piers Corbyn getting arrested.
Exactly. It's not really mainstream, is it?
No, it's not mainstream. I think people are quite common sense. Again, we have a commonsensical attitude towards vaccination compared to other countries. I think in spring and summer, certainly remembering last year, you will get youth gatherings, won't you? Sort of block
yes.
parties, but we're not seeing, and that I can't spot at the moment, a kind of mass, 100,000 people walking through central London in protest at the restrictions. That's certainly true.
Well, Patrick O'Flynn, it's been fascinating discussing with you the libertarian view of these lockdown restrictions, and we'll wonder whether the argument might go towards you over the next few months. But do come back on this podcast if you can, and we'll hear from you later this year. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Christopher. Been a pleasure.
I think Patrick is speaking maybe for a lot of people out there who feel that the government is slightly getting too involved in our lives, and perhaps that might be a window for any politician out there who wants to try and make a mark this year. Well, I'd love to know what you think, and please do get in touch. Email us, chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk, or tweet us at Choppers Podcast. And if you're feeling really generous, why not share your thoughts on the show on Apple Podcasts? Leave us a rating and a review, just like someone called Demoralised Dave did this week. He said, "Excellent podcast, varied, valuable insights from interesting people." Well, thank you, Dave, and here's hoping we can get you a bit less demoralised soon. Thanks to all my guests this week, Michelle Donelan, Sir Stephen Bubb, and of course Patrick O'Flynn. Thank you to my brilliant producers, Louisa Wells, Elliot Lampitt, and Theo Luludis. But most importantly of all, thank you to you for listening. Without you listening in, we couldn't make this podcast happen. Please do think about supporting our brilliant work by subscribing. If you want to go to telegraph.co.uk/chopper, we can get your first month completely free of charge. And of course, if you can, please do buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph. You won't regret it. Until next time, though, cheerio!